One of the main themes that we've been talking about is the transformation of the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries into a more urbanized, industrialized country. And along with that, there was a huge influx of immigrants into the United States, most of them from Southern and Eastern Europe. As has often been the case in American history, a large wave of immigration was often followed by a pushback against immigration. And the decade of the 1920s in the United States was characterized in many respects by xenophobia, which is a fear of foreigners or perceived foreign influences. World War I was certainly a factor in this. At the end of the war, there was the revolution in Russia, which eventually led to the formation of the world's first communist government. And in the United States, at the end of the war, there was a Red Scare. The term Red Scare is often associated with the McCarthy period in the late 1940s and early 1950s, but the first Red Scare in American history took place after World War I in 1919 and 1920. There were some real reasons for concern because there was a wave of terrorist attacks in the United States in 1919, including a series of bombs sent largely through the U.S. Postal Service. Fortunately, almost all of these were intercepted by the authorities, but it did lead to a fear of foreign-born terrorism. Not all the terrorists, of course, were foreign-born, but several of them were. Anyway, this led to something that's usually referred to as the Palmer Raids, a name for the Attorney General of the United States, Mitchell Palmer, who decided to root out alleged subversives and radicals by having his Justice Department conduct raids and rounding up and deporting several hundred people who were accused of being foreign-born radicals. The problem with the Palmer raids was, as is often the case, a lot of people got swept up in this who were completely innocent. But that was one of the first manifestations right at the beginning of the decade of xenophobia. After that, we do see an increasing backlash against immigration, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe. In 1924, Congress finally responded to growing pressure and passed the Immigration Act of 1924, which all but shut the door in the faces of further immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. There was also a famous court case in the 1920s that illustrated the theme of xenophobia, and this was the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were two Italian-born immigrants who admittedly espoused radical causes, but in May of 1920, they were both arrested and charged with murder and robbery in a suburb of Boston, Massachusetts. There is some evidence that Sacco and Vanzetti may have been guilty of the crimes of which they were accused, but many people at the time and since believe that they were essentially railroaded and sent to the electric chair, not so much because of any hard evidence as because of their foreign birth and their radical political views. It certainly didn't help matters any when the judge who presided over the case was overheard saying things like, "I'll get those two anarchist bastards hanged." Anyway, the Sacco-Vanzetti case aroused worldwide outrage, and eventually the governor of Massachusetts appointed a high-level commission to investigate the case and make some recommendations to him as to whether or not Sacco and Vanzetti had received a fair trial. After reviewing the evidence and the proceedings from the case, this committee recommended that the execution go forward, and so in 1927, their case having spanned almost the entire decade, Sacco and Vanzetti were electrocuted. But many people continue to believe that they were convicted largely because of their foreign birth and their radical political views more than any hard evidence. So their case became a symbol of the theme of xenophobia in the 20s. Another phenomenon associated with xenophobia in the 20s was the rise of the new Ku Klux Klan. The original KKK, of course, had existed only in the South during the Reconstruction period, but it had pretty much gone out of existence at the end of Reconstruction. In 1915, the Klan was reborn in Stone Mountain, Georgia. But after World War I, the Klan started to spread across the nation. As with the original Klan, the KKK of the 20s was opposed to African Americans, but this version of the Klan was really more opposed to immigrants, Catholics, Jews, and anything that smacked of foreign radicalism, and therefore it started to gain a wide following in areas outside the South. In fact, this version of the Klan, which peaked in the early and mid-1920s, had more members in states like Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, and Oregon than it did in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. And one reason this Klan attracted such a wide following, even in the Northeast, was that it represented itself as a super patriot organization devoted to what it called 100% Americanism. The idea being that if you were a true American patriot, then you should join the Ku Klux Klan. And for a brief period in the early and mid-20s, the Klan did become a major power in both political parties and a major force, therefore, in American politics. The Klan declined rather rapidly in the late 20s, but it was largely because it had accomplished its mission by getting Congress to severely restrict the flow of immigrants into the United States. The 20s also witnessed what today we might refer to as a culture war between Americans who still believed in the older traditional values and those who embraced change. There were several examples of this, but to highlight a couple, the 20s was the decade of Prohibition. The 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which prohibited the manufacture, transport, or sale of alcoholic beverages in the United States, went into effect at the beginning of the decade. It, of course, was later repealed, but not until 1933. In the meantime, Prohibition became one of the most divisive issues of the 20s. Generally speaking, rural Americans and more traditional Christians supported Prohibition, even though they sometimes had their own still out back. Anyway, these forces were known as the Dries. Urban Americans generally wanted to see Prohibition repealed, and so they were referred to as the Wets. Of course, one thing that Prohibition led to was a rise in organized crime. Most notoriously, I guess, Al Capone in Chicago became one of the richest men in America by providing illegal but still available alcohol to those who wanted it. The Prohibition issue, among other things, almost destroyed the Democratic Party in 1924 when the rural-based Dries duked it out with the urban-based Wets, and it took the Democrats 103 ballots to even select a presidential nominee in 1924. Another issue related to the culture wars of the 20s was the anti-evolution crusade. More traditional Protestant Christians were often upset at the implications of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, and in the early 20th century, a few states, all of them in the South, passed laws making it illegal to teach Darwinism in the public schools. The peak of the anti-evolution crusade came in the state of Tennessee in 1925 when a high school biology teacher and football coach named John Scopes was arrested and charged with violating Tennessee's anti-evolution statute. Scopes lived in a small town in East Tennessee called Dayton, and some of the local business leaders welcomed the trial because it thought it would put their town on the map. They were correct in this, but the publicity that the case generated was not exactly favorable. What made it into a real media event, and by media at this point we mean print media, but also the relatively new medium of radio, was the fact that two of the most famous men in America got involved in the case. William Jennings Bryan, three-time presidential candidate and former Secretary of State, came to Dayton to aid the prosecution, and Clarence Darrow of Chicago, probably the most famous lawyer of his generation, came to Dayton to assist in Scopes' defense. Anyway, the case generated quite a bit of publicity, most of it negative for the town of Dayton and for the South as a whole. In the end, it was an open and shut case because Tennessee had passed a law prohibiting the teaching of evolution in the public schools. Scopes had clearly done that, so he was found guilty and given a $100 fine. But what it made it into a much larger case was the presence of Bryan and Darrow, and also the larger issue of evolution versus biblical creation, and also, of course, issues of academic freedom and freedom of speech. Finally, there was the presidential election of 1928, which pitted Republican Herbert Hoover against Democrat Al Smith. Al Smith, the governor of New York, represented almost everything that many rural Americans hated and feared most. He was the son of Irish immigrants, he was a Roman Catholic, and he was wet, meaning that he was opposed to prohibition. In fact, if the Democrats had tried to manufacture a candidate who carried more baggage in rural America than Al Smith, they would have been hard-pressed to do so. At any rate, many clergymen, Protestant clergymen in the South in particular, got involved in the 1928 presidential campaign, and it got pretty nasty. In the end, Hoover won the election largely because the economy was booming. Hoover, as a conservative pro-business Republican, was taking credit for the prosperity boom of the 20s. But many people saw the abuse of Al Smith in the 1928 election as further proof that the country was coming apart along urban-rural lines. Finally, as far as foreign policy in the 20s, a label that's often applied to American foreign policy in the 20s is isolationist, but I think a better label is unilateralist. The United States did not completely isolate itself from the rest of the world in the 20s, but it did seek to go its own way. One example of that, of course, is that the United States never joined the League of Nations. Ironically, at a time when the United States was retreating from the world stage a bit in the 20s, American mass culture was taking over the world. And two examples of that are American movies and also jazz music. Overall, the 20s was a very complicated decade. On the surface, all was golden. The economy was booming. American mass consumer culture was triumphing. But there were these deep divisions within the country. And of course, at the very end of the decade, it all came crashing down after the great crash on Wall Street and the onset of the Great Depression.